Is federal censorship going to be the biggest legacy of the pandemic? The Supreme Court heard a case on Monday where they were looking at whether federal agencies should have the right to censor social media to suppress any criticism of federal policies such as COVID policies, foreign policies, even economic policies. A lot of people were surprised to hear Supreme Court justices talking as if the First Amendment is now a weapon of mass destruction. Back in 1919, the Supreme Court had an opinion in which it justified suppressing censorship of government policies because that was like shouting fire in a crowded theater. What we have now, what the Supreme Court might do this time, is effectively prohibit people from shouting BS during a pandemic. Supreme Court spent 2 hours wrangling on the case of Murthy versus Missouri. This is a lawsuit brought by folks censored by social media thanks to federal intervention. Last July 4th, federal judge Terry Dowdy issued a 155-page opinion in which he walked through how the feds had browbeaten, jawboned, coerced social media companies to force them to suppress criticism of the COVID vaccines, U.S. policy, foreign policy, and many other things. The judge said this was the most massive attack against free speech in U.S. history, probably. There were so many strange elements to this case, and one is that the federal government was presumed to be the fount of truth. And thus it was, a lot of the justices felt like that the government should be able to suppress disinformation or misinformation because government is truth itself. It was surreal because you had the justices not recognizing that the federal government itself had been the biggest source of misinformation during the pandemic. You had President Biden out there promising people if they got the COVID vaccine, they would not get COVID. That was true, plus or minus 100 million COVID cases. And some of the sentiments from the judges, you had Justice Brown Jackson. She epitomized the Beltway establishment. She said, "My biggest concern is the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in important time periods." Now, Justice Jackson took an oath to uphold the Constitution, but maybe there was a typo in her copy of the Constitution. Maybe the First Amendment in her version said that Congress will make no law hamstring the federal government. She also captured the Washington attitude because Washingtonians think the First Amendment is archaic because Americans have become village idiots and the government has to protect them from themselves. Justice Jackson warned that if we didn't have censorship, vast numbers of American teenagers might start jumping out of high windows. As she kept talking about that, it really made me wonder if Justice Jackson in high school health class had watched the movie Reefer Madness once too often. You almost had the impression the Supreme Court thinks the role of Americans is for paying, obeying, and wearing a federal blindfold, especially on topics like COVID. It gets worse. The New York Times quoted enthusiastically a top federal censor who said that the government has to take steps to protect our cognitive infrastructure. Cognitive infrastructure. That makes me really nervous. I mean, makes me wonder if the feds and the New York Times think that the government should secretly rewire Americans' brains or what? The same class of government experts who cannot even run the New York subway or the Washington subway should somehow be given control over our thoughts. It's interesting, most of the press coverage simply portrayed this as a question of whether social media will be able to, raise doubts on this or that policy. But this case could determine who wins the 2024 presidential election. Back in 2020, the feds massively censored Americans online who raised doubts about mail-in ballots. Biden won the 2020 election thanks to millions of unverified mail-in ballots. A lot of people tried to complain about that online, but you had the FBI and other agencies browbeating Twitter and other places to suppress any criticism or doubts about mail-in ballots. Part of the ruling in this case was intended to prohibit federal agencies from meddling in the 2024 election by censoring Americans. Censoring America's comments on the government, on politicians, on election procedures. This is something which was understood for at least 200 years in this country that the government cannot do that kind of crap. However, it changed in 2020. We had similar nonsense in 2022. And so you had this injunction, but what the Supreme Court did was cancel that injunction for the time it was considering this case. Unless the Supreme Court puts a leash back on federal agencies as far as censoring Americans' comments on the election and politicians, it's possible that there will be another censorship tsunami from federal agencies that could taint the 2024 presidential election. And people in Washington wonder why Americans are cynical. Is the joke now on anyone who expects the Supreme Court to uphold the First Amendment? If censorship is the new salvation, is the defense of freedom utterly damned?